Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of our Community Access. This week, Terry visited with a local cemetery historian in Oxford. Then we have another great dog from the Canine Rescue League, and we're all today at our Community Access. Welcome back. Now, if you enjoy about history, you would really like this program. With the story is our reporter, Terry Stile. Terry?
Hi Bill, you can probably guess where I'm at, my favorite cemetery in Oxford, and I am with a gentleman who wants to do some history on this cemetery. It's the Oxford Township Cemetery, and I'm with Jim Lehtola. Jim, tell me what you have in mind to do here, and I think maybe we could get you some volunteers.
Well, I'd love to hear that because right now we're planning a tour here at the cemetery on October 15th this year. We're going to follow the plans that some of the other organizations have in the area. Rochester Avon has done them. The Better Pontiac Group has done them. But what they usually do is they pick out half a dozen sites in a cemetery. They have reenactors who play the roles of somebody in the past, and they tell the story of that family or that person. So the research has been done. We've got, I believe it's 8 individuals we're going to do. They'll all be pioneers that arrived in the Oxford area before 1835. So that's what we're looking for now is volunteers and people to help out and maybe some sponsors.
Okay, and so you've already got names picked out. It's family names that go back to the 1800s, right?
Yeah, they would have all been families that arrived here before 1835.
And like we were talking a little bit earlier, there's names in this cemetery that coincide with street names, etc. How old is this, or do you know what maybe the oldest grave in the cemetery is?
I'm not sure that the oldest grave is actually marked. I think the first burial was right after the cemetery was purchased back in 1837. Back then they would have been using wood markers, so you know that may be lost in time now. Over the years, the cemetery has developed. I'm not sure right offhand which one is actually the oldest at this point.
So the cemetery started in the 1830s. Rattle off some of the names that you might recognize. I know you've been in the community a while, maybe not 2 or 3 generations, but you've been here a long time, and you're studying this. Name a couple of names that we might recognize.
Well, probably Crawford, Axford, Glassby, Burdick, Hubby, Moyer. So you pretty much cover, you can almost go through town and look at some of the street names. Well, I thought what we'd do is we'd go up to where the old burying ground starts in the division between the old burying ground and the addition, so you can see the difference and how to recognize where the old burial ground is. And then we'll take a short walk through the cemetery and maybe some of the more unusual monuments in the cemetery. We'll just talk to them about them briefly and kind of give you a little bit of explanation of what's going on.
Awesome. Let's go.
These are the 2 Crawford brothers here. Clarence Crawford is the furthest one. Of course, you know where Crawford Street is, and there's the large house right there at Crawford in Washington. Right, yeah. That was his home. Him and his brother were involved in selling agricultural products from the Oxford area, and they did quite well at that. And it was also Mr. Crawford that was selling the idea of manufacturing an automobile here in Oxford at one time, the Detroit Oxford automobile. Right. So that's Mr. Crawford right there. They actually also owned a wagon manufacturing shop, so they produced one prototype that was seen driving around town and everything, but as far as everybody knows, that's the only car that was ever produced.
Oh my goodness, isn't that interesting? So that would have been like the mid to late late 1800s?
Right around 1900, just after 1900. I read somewhere where around in that time period in the United States there were more than 1,000 companies interested in the idea of manufacturing automobiles. And
Oh my goodness.
obviously it's got narrowed down over the years.
Yeah, the Ford brothers came in, huh?
Right here is C.L. Randall family. C.L. Randall family, you don't hear the name too much, but you're probably familiar because you drive by his house probably every day. It's the large house on the north side of Burdick Street, just by Pontiac Street there. That was originally the C.L. Randall home.
Oh, was it? Okay,
Yes.
and then it became the Pattersons.
Then it was known as the Patterson home.
So what were the C.L. Randalls to this community?
They were the same thing. They started selling agricultural products. They had storage facilities. At one time Oxford was known for potatoes and rutabagas, so they had storage facilities for storing that. They also owned some grain elevators, not only in Oxford, but I believe they also had a grain elevator in Milford, and
My goodness.
I forget where the additional one was.
Wow, quite a ways from here.
Yeah, so they spread out quite a bit. It's really a beautiful piece of ground. I read somewhere where, the old farmers were kind of practical about what they used for a cemetery. They didn't want to turn over good farmland for a cemetery, so oftentimes they would pick an area that was not easy to farm. And it looks like that might apply here with all the rolling hills and everything, that it would have been pretty hard to do anything with horses as far as pulling farm equipment, but it's absolutely beautiful spot, especially when you get on top of the hill here with the leaves just coming.
Goodness. You can see everywhere. You can see over to the new subdivisions and everything.
It's kind of difficult choosing, which ones to include, because you really look for a good story.
Now here's Axford.
This is the Axford Monument. Samuel Axford came here in about 1834, I believe.
Oh wow.
And he built right across from Deming, who was the first resident in Oxford.
Is that right?
He told stories of when he first got to the Oxford community, the Indians even helped him plant some of his crops and helped harvest them.
Oh my goodness, isn't that something?
This is Mr. Dunlap. He was a farmer and township supervisor for quite some time. Of course, you recognize that as Dunlap Road, and oddly enough, the township hall is now located on Dunlap
How
Road.
appropriate, and it looks like he had a pretty large family.
Yeah, well, all the farm families were pretty large. They had a lot of children die in infancy. You can see one is marked here, baby, 1891 to 1891. So there was, life was a little bit different
here's
then.
another one right next, Lulu.
Yeah.
1877 to 1877.
So there's a
My goodness, yeah.
So there's a fairly high infant mortality rate, but they had large families. They could, on a farm, they could sustain a large family, and it helped with all the work.
Sure did. Right.
I think PBS had a show that I thought probably the best description of an old farm was, as soon as spring came, they spent all their time preparing for the next winter. Everything you grew, everything you did was all leading up to the next winter, and you had to be prepared for that next winter period when you wouldn't have those things. So.
Yeah, it's like watching, there's a show, the Alaskan bush people or Alaskan people in Alaska do that now. We were doing this in the 1800s to survive. We forget how convenient we have it compared to what people did to sustain and grow this community.
Right.
We really need to appreciate it a little bit more, I guess. This is lovely.
But you'll notice as we're walking through on the addition here that the graves are basically buried in plots. And if you look here,
like plots,
if you look here, you can see an aisle going this way. And if you look this way, you can see aisles going this way. One of the things that always kind of puzzled me about how do they mark the graves, or how do they decide where the stones go? My understanding is that just depends on the community. What is the tradition in the community? In Oxford, they are headstones. Typically for a headstone is to the west, so the person, the idea is with the resurrection that they, as they stood facing the new day of the resurrection, they would stand facing the sun. So the headstones are on the west end of the grave. So if you're a little bit worried about walking across the grave, or if you're superstitious, as long as you're standing right here, you're not on the grave.
Not walking on anyone. Okay, good to know. So they're set up based on each community then. The way that
Right,
they're set
right.
up.
Some use
Okay.
some use footstones rather than headstones.
Okay.
But the writing is always going to be to the outside of the grave.
So I see a couple broken headstones. Do we have that a lot in our cemetery?
Well,
Just
I don't think
forget.
necessarily that maybe a lot of these were done intentionally, over the years, tree limbs and things falling on them. The older markers were a lot different stone than a modern marker. They were a softer stone.
Right.
That's part of the reason why they're a little bit harder to read. But you can see now, remember how orderly it looked just over there. See how now it looks kind of chaotic. You don't see those aisles. They're kind of set up in rows without those aisles going.
Yeah.
So we're standing in the old burying grounds now. And a lot of people point out the oak trees, that they believe the oak trees were planted around the perimeter of the old burying ground. So if you look at the oak trees, you can kind of get an idea where
Yeah, you can
that
see
is.
that.
Right.
Circle around. So this is the oldest part.
In fact, these along the driveway here are in the new addition, where the next row is in the original old burying grounds.
And you can almost tell the difference too between the stones. These stones that are
Sure.
impossible to read.
And the thing you think about too is when they did the addition in 1871, the railroad came through in 1872. So now they had access to a lot more quality stone
Sure.
for markers. So you can even see somewhat of a difference in the
In that 1 year.
in the markers from when the railroads came through. And of course, a lot of people went back and remarked them. The Van Wagner family, you can see. These were redone. These were redone by
this
one
is
of the.
around it.
Yeah, see, the
Okay.
original marker stood inside of there, and it's has since broken off, but they've marked who the person was. This was done by a descendant of the Van Wagner family who came back, and he was doing a family history. And my understanding is they would have a family reunion every year, and everybody would attend out in the Van Wagner family, and they would all donate money to go around the country and improve the headstones of their ancestors.
Oh, that's terrific.
And the Van Wagner family is pretty interesting because the two brothers, one is over here by the tree, the old gray marker you can hardly
my.
read.
Yeah,
That's one of them. And then the other one is one of the improved markers over here. And the interesting part was they originally went to the Rochester area with their father. And they were real early arrivals in Oakland County. They arrived in the 1820s. And then eventually they moved up here. But they had been working on the Erie Canal before they came to Michigan.
Goodness.
So a lot of these people have connections to, not only history here, but national
US
history.
Right, that's fascinating. And then, of course, the Van Wagners ended up, they were druggists. One of them was the Van Wagner drugstore, right? Right downtown? Or was that in Lake Orion?
I think that was in Lake Orion.
Okay,
I'm not
right,
sure.
okay.
I could be wrong. But, the Van Wagner family, actually, another thing about them is that they had, you start looking at the father who actually died in the Rochester area. He was a veteran of the Revolutionary War.
Oh, my goodness.
Jacob here, the son here, was a veteran of the War of 1812.
Oh, wow.
They had descendants serve in the Civil War, the World War I, and World War II, and the Cold War.
Oh, my goodness.
So
They were certainly dedicated to the country, weren't they? And they are here in our community. We should be really proud of that.
in fact, one of the descendants of the Van Wagners was the governor of the state of Michigan, too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And here's the Hovey family.
Oh, look at there. Yeah.
Now, the Hoveys were a little bit of a mystery to me because when he originally came, Horace indicated that he was a farmer, but I'm looking at old maps and everything, I've never seen where the Hovey farm was located.
Oh.
Well, I was looking at census forms a couple of weeks ago, trying to trace him down where he might have been. And at one time there was a hotel in the southwest business district downtown. Mm-hmm. It was called the Exchange Hotel. Oh. And it turns out Mr. Hovey was actually the proprietor of that hotel for a number of years.
Okay.
He had a large family, but he had a couple of sons that were really, really prosperous. And he and his wife ended up living with one of them in Muskegon. They were actually living in Muskegon when they died, but obviously they always considered Oxford their home, and they were returned home and buried.
Very nice. Yes. So the Hovey Street is after the family and not necessarily after one particular person? Or?
Well, I've seen a couple different sources on how Hovey Street got its name. One of them was that one of the Hoveys was a dentist and lived on the street and was named after him.
Okay, we'll take that. Why not?
You know, most of the records for the old burying ground are long lost. We're kind of fortunate that years ago the Genealogical Society went through and read a lot of the grave markers off and recorded what was written on them and who was buried where. And because they've deteriorated over the years now, it'd probably be very difficult to do it now. But we have that record, so we have a pretty good idea who's buried where.
And there's Baldwin.
Mr. Baldwin had his furniture emporium and funeral parlor where Centennial Park is now.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and I always thought that was a pretty interesting combination. He came to town. He actually started as a cabinet maker.
Okay.
And moved on to and included furniture, and then eventually
and then
he became
needed caskets.
Yep. Well, so I guess being the cabinet maker and the carpenter, you can make the caskets and do the funeral. I kind of like this one. Mr. and Mrs. Stroud, they came to Oxford a little bit later in life. But the interesting thing about Mr. Stroud, he was a shoemaker, and you know, just a trade that Oxford needed, so he came. But the interesting thing about him, he fought in the Battle of Black Rock in the War of 1812. And Black Rock is near Buffalo, New York. And what happened is the British came across the American forces, which was actually New York militia, including Mr. Stroud, tried to prevent their landing on the American side. And a battle ensued. Well, what they didn't realize is a second British group had crossed further down, and they were outflanking them, so they were forced to withdraw, and British went on and burnt down the city of Buffalo.
Is that right?
Well, it's a village then. But,
right. And so he was involved in those battles.
Yeah, where the Battle of Black Rock occurred, in my understanding, that's where the International Bridge stands now by Buffalo.
Oh,
it was built in the 1820s. I think they call it the Peace Bridge, actually.
Perfect. Yeah.
Mr. Powell will be on our tour this fall.
Okay.
He's the one that built the first wood frame tavern hotel in Oxford. That was later on the site of the Oakland House, just where the vacant lot is, just a few doors north of the museum. That's where he was at.
Okay.
And this is his son, Frank. Was actually Francis, but he was known as Frank. He was a Civil War veteran, had been a captain, and I don't remember the unit he was in offhand. But he had been in the Civil War. You know, a lot of those guys, just because of the conditions they served under, they came back and they were really deep, in terrible shape physically when they came back. And he died within a few years after the war.
35 years old, I see.
Yeah, pretty young.
Yeah, that's really
young. The Veterans Organization for the Civil War veterans was the Oxford started their chapter, the Grand Army of the Republic. It was named after Frank Powell.
Oh, really? Yeah. Okay.
William O. Davis, he's kind of an interesting one. His father organized one of the volunteer regiments and was a lieutenant colonel. He ended up resigning his commission, but he had signed up, and I believe he was enrolled as a sergeant. His younger brother also signed up in the unit. They were in a battle with the rebel forces down south, and Mr. Davis was shot. The bullet passed through him, struck his brother, who was just behind him. His brother ended up going to the Union Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee, and died there.
Oh my goodness.
So the bullet actually passed through him before it killed his brother. And his first son was born. He named his son after his brother.
Okay, so he survived the bullet passing through him.
Yeah.
Wow, isn't that something? Now, when they left here, were they shipped out on trains, or did they have
mostly from trains, but as they got down south, they didn't have that convenience anymore. So if you were in Nashville and they wanted you for the Battle of Atlanta, you marched there, you walked there, and that's so they're a lot of times living outdoors. Their food rations were pretty poor. A lot of marching, a lot of exposure to the weather. So that's why I say a lot of them came back and they had a lot of health problems. Mr. Dove, his wife, connected his death with his service. She said that she actually applied for his Civil War pension, saying that his lungs were never right after his service, and then after he died, she was destitute and needed his pension to survive.
Did she get it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Here's one of our mysteries in the cemetery.
Unknown soldier. Wow, I didn't know we had one.
We have 3,
Really?
believe it or not.
Had no idea. And so how do we even know that person was a soldier?
Well, when you look in the township records for this grave plot, the only thing written in there is a soldier is buried here.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
There's no name, no date associated with it.
Wow.
What's interesting, Mr. Brokenshaw had served in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he was actually stationed, his unit was stationed in Springfield, Illinois, when President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And when his body was returned to Springfield for his funeral and burial, his unit was the guard for Abraham Lincoln's funeral. And he was actually one of the honor guards standing by the casket.
Oh my goodness.
But he also owned the Hotel Commercial in downtown, which would have been almost across from the Oakland House. It's where the Miriam building, I believe, is today, is where the Hotel Commercial was.
Okay.
So I really wonder about the unknown soldier. You know, is this some poor soldier who happened to be in his hotel when he died, and nobody claimed the body and nobody had the funds, so he buried him in his family plot?
Oh.
But we have, at the top of the hill, we have the GAR plot. So if he's a soldier, why wouldn't he be buried up in the GAR plot?
Right.
And then in kind of my strange, convoluted, kind of romantic way, I wonder, could he have been a Confederate soldier and they wouldn't bury him in the GAR plot? And Mr. Brokenshaw
had a heart for a soldier.
had the heart for a soldier, so he buried him in the family plot.
Oh, I like your story. Let's keep that. That's a good one. It's very tender.
This is typical for a Civil War monument. The shield with the individual's name and the unit they served in. In this case, he's in Company D of the 14th Michigan Volunteer Infantry.
But we don't know whether he died during the Civil War or after.
Well, I would assume that it was after the war because
here.
because of the circumstances. Most times when somebody died during the war, they just were never returned to the
Left them
community.
there.
Yeah, so I think, and again, this is a marker that wouldn't have been done until, this part of the cemetery didn't exist until 1871.
Oh, okay, right.
And the
Makes
markers
sense.
didn't come till 1874 or so.
Got
So you would have,
sense.
you would, if he had been down south, he would have been around a long. It would have been difficult to bring him.
Sure, back up here. Find him and then bring him back up here.
This, the Bachelor family, like I said, I particularly kind of like their story. What happened was, Dr. Watts Bachelor had a practice up in Oakwood.
Oh, okay.
Him and his wife didn't have any children. John Bachelor was orphaned when he was 4 or 6 years old in Massachusetts. And he was in an institution there. If you've ever heard of the orphan trains, he was put on an orphan train and sent west. And Dr. Watts Bachelor and his wife adopted him from the orphan train. Well, Dr. John, he admired his father so much that he became a doctor.
Oh, that's cool.
Well, he was attending medical school in Detroit in 1896. Dr. Bachelor's practice was destroyed by the cyclone of 1896 when it went through Oakwood. So he lost his home, his office, all his medical instruments, everything. When John came home, they started a practice together. So the two doctors were actually practicing together. They had also adopted a daughter, but John Bachelor, when World War I broke out and they had the Spanish flu influenza epidemic, the pandemic actually, because it was worldwide, he volunteered for the Army, and they sent him to the camp where the influenza epidemic started and was most severe. And after that, he went to another camp down in Georgia that was having the same problem. So he actually volunteered to go into the Army to assist all these people that had the Spanish flu.
Sick, right?
Yeah.
So we're standing in the northwest corner of the cemetery. What would be the oldest part?
The oldest part would be the southwest corner of the cemetery, is where the old burying ground is located. It's approximately 1 acre, and then later on they added additional 6 acres when that 1 acre was starting to fill up.
So is there more rooms?
My understanding, Curtis Wright from Oxford Township says that he doesn't believe that there's any more plots available. There may be a grave spot here and there, but there's nothing for sale at this point.
So much for the family plots, and if we want to get a reservation, we have to stand by ourselves, right?
Well, the plots might be empty, but they might be owned by somebody else. The addition on the south side of Burdick Street, that's also full, but I understand there are still plots available both in North Oxford and at the Oakwood or cemetery.
Well, it says a lot for what the township does for our cemeteries. They keep them beautiful. They keep them well maintained. They make sure all the grave sites themselves, the stones are standing and everything. Not only here, but like you said, Oakwood Cemetery.
There are some stones that do need some work and some attention. At the Northeast Oakland Historical, we've kind of discussed that maybe this fundraiser from the tour, that maybe someone could go back to help improve some of these markers. We've also talked about even just cleaning some of them so they'd be more legible and you could more easily read the markers themselves.
Yeah, some of those older ones, they are hard to read.
They are.
Okay, so this October event, which I'm really excited about, I can't wait.
Well, you have to volunteer then and be an actress for us.
Well, I might have to do that. But how do people contact you if they're interested in doing that?
I think if they just contact the Northeast Oakland Historical Society, the museum has regular hours from 1 to 4 on Saturday, 1 to 4 on Thursday, and there's also a telephone number, which I don't know right off the top of my head, but they can also call the telephone number and leave a message.
And so you would need volunteers to be the actors, but also you probably need period costumes and people to volunteer for that as well?
Oh, correct. Yeah, that's one of the wonderful things about volunteering. You even get to come up with your own costume. So
you hear that? You can dress however you want. You just have to come up here and volunteer. Thank you for coming out here today.
Oh, not a problem. Anytime.
Back to you, Bill.
Now that was interesting. Next up is our dog of the week from the Canine Rescue League.
Hi there, my name is Karen and I've got my friend today with me. His name is Chubbs. He's an American Bulldog. We are outside at Canine Stray Rescue, located on Metamora Road, just north of town in Oxford. We probably have around 50 dogs here, and all of our dogs, including Chubbs, before they're adopted out, are up to date on their rabies and distemper shots. And they're also spayed and neutered and heartworm tested before they go home. Okay, so this is Chubbs, and like I said, he's an American Bulldog mix, probably between maybe around 2 years old. As you can see, he does like his toys. He's very curious, likes to see his people. He does prefer men. He does like the men over the women, but he's fine with both. He probably could use an active home. Maybe adults only, just probably because of his size and that. You want to come up here? Come on, buddy. You can visit our kennel every day but Tuesday and Wednesday. I'll come down here to his level here. And we also go to Petco on the 1st and 3rd Saturdays of the month. And we go to Harvest Time Pet Stuff on the 2nd and 4th Saturdays of the month. Petco is by Great Lakes Crossing and Harvest Time is just off of Lapeer Road in Oxford. And if you're interested in any of our dogs, or if you're not looking for a dog at this time, maybe possibly interested in volunteering with us, we are always looking for dog walkers, people to let the dogs out. There's one of our dog walkers right now, taking advantage of this gorgeous day that we're having right now. Or whatever your forte is, laundry. Come on out and visit us and see what we're all about. Chubbs just wants to go visit some more people, so thank you very much.
Just another great dog from the Canine Rescue League. Now they are located on 2120 Metamora Road, just about a mile north of Myers. Okay, well that's all the time for this week, and we hope you enjoyed our program. So, for our reporter Terry Stiles and photographers Russell Currier and Ashley Point, and for editors Terry Stiles and Ashley Point, I am Bill Service, and you have a great week.